The summer of 1878 blazed across the Texas plains with merciless intensity, turning the grasslands into an endless sea of amber and gold. Heat waves shimmered above the horizon, distorting the landscape into something that seemed more mirage than reality. In this harsh and unforgiving territory, survival depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to adapt to circumstances that could change as quickly as the weather. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Sarah Catherine Hayes, a young woman who lost her sight but discovered an inner strength she never knew existed. It's also the tale of Marcus Cole, a man branded an outlaw by society, yet possessed of a moral compass that would guide him toward an act of redemption. Their paths crossed at the banks of the Brazos River on a day when death seemed certain, but Providence had other plans. Sarah Hayes had known darkness for nearly 4 years, ever since the fever that swept through their ranch when she was 18 had claimed not only her vision, but also her mother's life. The illness had arrived with a traveling merchant, spreading through their small community like wildfire through dry grass. While Sarah survived, the price had been steep. Her world had shrunk from the vast expanse of the Hayes family ranch to the confines of her father's house, where she was treated more like a fragile ornament than a capable human being. Benjamin Hayes owned one of the largest cattle operations in Brazos County, a sprawling empire built through decades of hard work and shrewd business dealings. He was a man who understood the value of strength and despised weakness in any form. His daughter's blindness represented a failure he couldn't accept, a reminder of mortality in a world where he'd always believed himself invincible. After his wife's death, Benjamin had remarried within a year, choosing Victoria Caldwell, a widow from Austin with 2 sons of her own. Victoria was beautiful, calculating, and utterly without compassion for the stepdaughter who represented nothing but an obstacle to her own ambitions. Her sons, Robert and James Caldwell, had inherited their mother's cruel nature and their stepfather's sense of entitlement. The Hayes Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Texas grazing land, watered by several streams that fed into the Brazos River. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the valley, a testament to Benjamin's success with its wraparound porches and imported furnishings. But for Sarah, it had become a prison where she was kept isolated from the world she had once known. On the morning that would change everything, Sarah sat in the parlor listening to the sounds of preparation filtering through the house. Her stepmother and stepbrothers were discussing business matters in voices they thought were too low for her to hear, but Sarah's enhanced hearing had become finely attuned to the subtle currents of conversation around her. "The railroad syndicate has made their final offer," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had maneuvered events to her advantage. "They're willing to pay premium prices for the water rights along the river bottom." And fathers agreed to sell? This was Robert, the elder of Victoria's sons, whose voice carried the same calculating tone as his mother's. "He's considering it seriously," Victoria replied. "The only complication is Sarah. As long as she's alive, she maintains certain legal claims to the property through her mother's side of the family." Sarah's blood ran cold as the implications of this conversation settled over her. She had known that her stepmother resented her presence, but she hadn't realized the extent to which her very existence posed a threat to Victoria's plans. "That problem could be solved," James suggested, his voice carrying a casual cruelty that made Sarah's stomach turn. "Accidents happen on ranches all the time. A blind girl wandering too close to the river." "James," Victoria's voice held a note of warning, but not the shock or horror that such a suggestion should have provoked. "We must be careful. Benjamin still has feelings for the girl, misguided though they may be. Sarah rose quietly from her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to find her father, had to warn him about what his new family was planning. But as she moved toward the door, she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. "Sarah, darling," Victoria's voice called out, honey sweet and utterly false. "We were just discussing plans for the day. It's such beautiful weather. Don't you think we should take advantage of it?" The door opened, and Sarah sensed her stepmother's presence, accompanied by the heavier footsteps of her sons. She straightened her shoulders, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I was just going to find Father," Sarah said, proud. That her voice remained steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Oh, I'm afraid he's already ridden out to check the south pasture," Victoria replied smoothly. "He won't be back until evening. But Robert and James have volunteered to take you for a picnic by the river. Won't that be lovely?" Sarah's enhanced senses picked up the subtle signals that others might have missed. The slight tension in Victoria's voice, the shuffling of feet that suggested her stepbrothers were positioned to block her exit, the artificial nature of the entire conversation. She was trapped and they all knew it. "That's very kind," Sarah managed, "but I think I'd prefer to stay inside today." "Nonsense," Victoria insisted, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "You spend far too much time indoors. The fresh air will do you good." What followed felt like a carefully choreographed dance of deception. Sarah was given no real choice in the matter. Robert and James flanked her as they walked from the house, their grips on her arms firm enough to guide her, but gentle enough to maintain the pretense of assistance rather than compulsion. The journey to the river took nearly an hour, following a winding path through pastureland and stands of cottonwood trees. Sarah tried to memorize every detail of their route, every turn and landmark, but her captors seemed to be deliberately taking an indirect path that would make it difficult for her to find her way back. "The river's running high this year," Robert observed as they approached the water's edge. "All that spring rain up north has really swollen the current." Sarah could hear the Brazos rushing past with unusual force, the water moving much faster than she remembered from her childhood visits. To this spot, the river had always been dangerous, but now it sounded positively treacherous. "Maybe we should find a calmer spot," she suggested, genuine concern mixing with her growing dread. "Oh, this is perfect," James replied, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice, cold and predatory. "The view is spectacular from right here." They guided her to what felt like a fallen log near the water's edge, encouraging her to sit while they unpacked the picnic Victoria had prepared. But Sarah noticed that neither of her stepbrothers seemed interested in eating, and the conversation gradually died away into an uncomfortable silence. "You know, Sarah," Robert said eventually, his voice taking on a contemplative tone that didn't fool her for a moment, "we've been thinking about your situation." "My situation?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Your condition," James clarified. "It must be difficult, being dependent on others for everything, never being able to see the world around you, never having the freedom to make your own choices." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "I manage quite well, thank you. But is that really living?" Robert pressed. "Sometimes, when life becomes too much of a burden, maybe it's better to just let go." The meaning behind his words was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a surge of desperate anger. "You're suggesting I should kill myself?" "We're suggesting," James said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "that accidents happen, and sometimes they're really a mercy." Sarah rose to her feet, backing away from the log, but she could hear both men standing as well, moving to flank her once again. The rushing water sounded louder now, closer, and she realized with horrible clarity that they had positioned her at the very edge of the riverbank. "My father will never believe I simply fell in," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Despite the terror gripping her heart. "Your father is grieving," Robert replied. "He'll believe what he needs to believe, and Mother will be there to comfort him." "Besides," James added, "blind people have accidents all the time. Everyone knows how dangerous the river can be." Sarah took another step backward and felt the ground growing soft beneath her feet. The riverbank was eroding, undermined by the spring floods, and she was running out of solid ground, but she refused to make this easy for them. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "Someone will figure out what really happened." "Who?" Robert laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You have no friends, no allies. Father's too busy with his business, affairs, to pay attention to a daughter who can't even see him. And Mother, well, Mother will be devastated by your tragic accident." Sarah's mind raced, searching for some way out of this impossible situation. She could hear the water rushing below, could feel the unstable ground beneath her feet, could sense her stepbrothers closing in from either side. There seemed to be no escape. "Any last words?" James asked, his voice carrying mock solemnity. Sarah straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Yes," she said clearly. "I forgive you." The words seemed to take both men by surprise, and in that moment of hesitation, Sarah made her choice. Rather than wait for them to push her, she stepped backward off the bank, choosing her own moment of entry into the rushing water. The Brazos River was shockingly cold, despite the summer heat, and the current was even stronger than she had imagined. Sarah's heavy skirts immediately began to drag her down, and she fought desperately to keep her head above water as the river swept her away from her would-be murderers. Behind her, she could hear Robert and James shouting, their voices carrying panic now that their carefully planned accident had turned into something far more dramatic and potentially suspicious. But their voices quickly faded as the current carried her downstream, away from the familiar landmarks of her family's ranch and into unknown territory. Sarah had learned to swim as a child, but that was before her illness, before the weakness that had accompanied her blindness. Now battling the current while hampered by her heavy clothing, she felt her strength failing rapidly. The water filled her mouth and nose, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she was going to die. But she was not going to die as the victim of her step-family's cruelty. She was going to die on her own terms, having chosen courage over capitulation in the final moments of her life. The river swept her along for what felt like miles, battering her against submerged rocks and fallen trees. Her dress tore on snags, her shoes were pulled from her feet, and her carefully arranged hair came loose, streaming behind her in the current. But somehow she managed to keep her head above water, gasping for air whenever the river's rhythm allowed. Just when she thought her strength was completely exhausted, when her arms could no longer fight the current and her legs had gone numb with cold, Sarah felt the river begin to slow. The banks widened here, and the water spread out into a broader, calmer channel. She managed to grab onto a partially submerged branch, hauling herself partway out of the water to rest. Her lungs burned as she coughed up river water, and her body shook uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. But she was alive, and that realization filled her with a fierce joy that surprised her with its intensity. She had survived her stepfamily's attempt to murder her, and she was free from their control for the first time in years. But as the immediate danger passed, Sarah began to confront the reality of her situation. She was miles from home, alone, in the wilderness, without shoes or adequate clothing, and utterly unable to see her surroundings. The river had carried her beyond any landmarks she might have recognized, and she had no idea which direction might lead to safety. The branch she clung to was sturdy enough to keep her from being swept away again, but it wasn't going to provide long-term salvation. She needed to find dry land, shelter, and some way to signal for help. but how could a blind woman navigate unknown terrain without falling into another deadly trap? As if in answer to her desperate thoughts, Sarah heard something that made her heart leap with hope. Hoofbeats approaching along what must be a trail running parallel to the river. Someone was coming, and they might be willing to help her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Help!" she called out, her voice hoarse from swallowing river water but carrying clearly across the water. "Please, someone help me!" The hoofbeat stopped, and Sarah heard a man's voice, rough and cautious. "Well, I'll be damned. What in hell are you doing in the river, miss?" "Please," Sarah gasped, still clinging to her precarious perch. "I fell upstream. I can't see, and I can't get to shore." A pause followed, and Sarah could almost feel the stranger evaluating her situation. Then the voice called out again, closer. "Now." "Hold on, miss. I'm coming to get you." Sarah heard the man dismount, followed by the sound of boots on rocky ground as he made his way to the water's edge. "Can you swim at all?" he asked. "A little," Sarah replied, "but I'm so tired." "Don't worry about that," the voice assured her. "I've got a rope. I'm going to throw it to you and you grab hold. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, then realized he might not be able to see the gesture. "Yes, I can try." The rope landed in the water near her with a splash, and Sarah fumbled for it with numb fingers. When she finally grasped it, she felt a surge of relief, so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Good girl," the man said, his voice carrying approval and something that might have been admiration. "Now hold tight, I'm going to pull you in." The journey to shore was surprisingly gentle, with the stranger taking care not to drag her against the rocky bottom. When Sarah finally felt solid ground beneath her feet, she collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relief. "Easy. There," the man said, his voice closer now. "You're safe now." Sarah looked up toward the sound of his voice, her sightless eyes seeking the face she couldn't see. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." "Maybe," the man replied, his tone carrying a hint of wariness. "But before you get too grateful, miss, you should know something about me." Sarah waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "Name's Marcus Cole," he continued, "and there's a price on my head from here to the Colorado border. You might want to rethink your gratitude." Despite everything she had been through, Sarah found herself smiling. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I was just thrown into a river by my own family, who wanted me dead. Right now, I'm not particularly concerned about your reputation." Marcus Cole studied the bedraggled young woman sitting on the riverbank, her dark hair streaming with water and her dress torn and muddy. There was something about her that didn't fit with his usual experience of helpless victims. Despite her obvious vulnerability, she possessed a dignity and strength that impressed him. "Well then," he said finally, "I guess we both have our problems. Question is, what do we do about them?" Sarah raised her chin, water still dripping from her tangled hair. "I suppose that depends on whether you're the kind of outlaw who helps people or the kind who hurts them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "I guess we'll both find out," he said at last. Marcus Cole had spent the better part of 15 years learning to read people quickly and accurately. In his line of work, misjudging someone's character could mean the difference between freedom and a noose. As he looked down at the young woman he'd just pulled from the Brazos River, every instinct told him he was looking at trouble of a kind he'd never encountered before. She was clearly from money. That much was obvious, even with her fine dress torn and muddy. The fabric, though damaged, was expensive silk, and her hands showed none of the calluses that marked working people. But there was something in her bearing, in the way she held her chin high despite her bedraggled state, that suggested she was tougher than her appearance indicated. "First things first," Marcus said, shrugging out of his leather jacket. "You need to get warm and dry, or you'll catch your death sitting there in wet clothes." He draped the jacket around Sarah's shoulders, noting how she startled slightly at his approach. Her blindness wasn't something she was trying to hide, he realized. She simply couldn't see him coming. Thank you," Sarah said, pulling the jacket closer around herself. The leather was warm from his body heat and carried the scents of horse, gunpowder, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "I don't suppose you have any other clothes I could borrow?" Marcus almost smiled at the practical question. Most ladies of her obvious breeding would have been having vapors by now, not calmly discussing wardrobe changes with a stranger. "I've got some spare gear in my saddlebags, but it won't exactly fit." "I don't care about fit," Sarah replied firmly. "I care about not dying of exposure." This time Marcus did smile, though she couldn't see it. "Fair enough. But first, we need to figure out what your family's going to do when they realize you're not floating face down in the river." Sarah's expression darkened. "They'll probably be disappointed." The bitter tone in her voice told Marcus there was a lot more to her story than a simple accident. He'd spent enough time around desperate people to recognize the sound of someone who'd been pushed to their breaking point. "You said they threw you in?" he asked, settling down on a nearby rock where he could keep watch on both her and the surrounding area. Old habits died hard, and Marcus had survived this long by never letting his guard down completely. Sarah nodded, then seemed to realize he might not see the gesture. "My stepmother and her sons. They wanted me out of the way." "Why?" The simple question hung in the air between them. Sarah found herself considering how much to tell this stranger who had saved her life. Everything about the situation defied the social conventions she'd been raised with. She was alone with a man she'd never met, an outlaw by his own admission, wearing his jacket and contemplating changing into his clothes. A week ago, such circumstances would have been unthinkable. Now they represented her only chance at survival. "Money?" she said finally. "It always comes down to money, doesn't it?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Usually does. What kind of money are we talking about?" Sarah hesitated, then decided that honesty was her best policy. If Marcus Cole was going to help her, he needed to understand what he was getting himself into. "My father owns the Hayes Ranch, 15,000 acres along the Brazos. But the land originally belonged to my mother's family. And when she died, certain rights passed to me. My stepmother can't sell the water rights to the railroad syndicate as long as I'm alive to contest it." Marcus let out a low whistle. "Railroad money. That's serious business." Serious enough to kill for, apparently. The matter-of-fact way she said it impressed Marcus despite himself. This wasn't a pampered rich girl having a dramatic fit. This was someone who had looked death in the face and come away with her eyes wide open about the world's cruelties. "What's your plan now?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I suppose I need to get back to town, find a lawyer, and expose what they tried to do." "And how exactly do you plan to prove it? It'll be your word against theirs, and your—" He paused, not wanting to be cruel. "Blind," Sarah finished for him. "I know, not exactly a credible witness in most people's eyes." Marcus studied her thoughtfully. "There might be another way." "What do you mean?" "Well, right now they think you're dead, right? That gives you an advantage." Sarah frowned. "How is being presumed dead an advantage?" "Because they'll act like you're dead. They'll make their moves, have their conversations, maybe get careless. People tend to relax when they think their problems are solved." The idea was intriguing, but Sarah could see immediate problems. "Where would I go? How would I survive? I can't exactly check into a hotel." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could almost hear him thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of reluctance. "I've got a place, remote, safe. You could stay there while we figure out how to prove what they did." "Why would you help me?" Sarah asked directly. "You don't know me, and as you pointed out, you're an outlaw. Helping me won't exactly improve your situation." It was a fair question, and Marcus found himself struggling to answer it. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, especially with respectable folks who would only bring him trouble. But something about this woman's courage, her refusal to collapse into self-pity despite everything that had happened to her, stirred something in him he'd thought was long dead. "Maybe I'm tired of running," he said finally. "Maybe it's time I did something decent for a change." Sarah sensed there was more to it than that, but she didn't press. They both had their secrets, their reasons for being here at this moment. The important thing was that he was offering her a chance at survival. "All right," she said, "I accept your help, but I want to be clear about something." "What's that?" "I won't be a burden. I may be blind, but I'm not helpless. I'll do my share of whatever needs doing." Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by her determination. "Can you ride?" "I could before I lost my sight. I suppose I can learn again." "Good, because we need to get moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely someone's going to spot us." He rose and walked to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had carried him through more dangerous situations than he cared to count. From his saddlebags, he retrieved a spare shirt and a pair of trousers that would be far too large for Sarah, but would at least be dry and warm. "These will have to be done until we can get you something better," he said, pressing the clothes into her hands. "There's a stand of trees about 50 yards upstream where you can change in private." Sarah stood carefully, testing her balance. The ordeal in the river had left her weak, but she was determined not to show it. "How will I find my way back?" "I'll call out to you. Just follow the sound of my voice." The simple confidence in his words reassured Sarah more than elaborate promises might have. Marcus Cole might be an outlaw, but he was a man of his word. Changing clothes while blind was always a challenge, but doing so in unfamiliar surroundings while wearing a stranger's oversized garments was particularly difficult. Sarah fumbled with the buttons and tried to roll up sleeves and pants legs that were far too long for her small frame. The result was hardly fashionable, but it was dry and warm, which was all that mattered. "I'm ready," she called out when she'd finished. "Follow my voice," Marcus replied, and Sarah made her way carefully back toward the sound, using her hands to feel her way past low-hanging branches and around rocks. When she reached him, Marcus couldn't help but notice how different she looked. In men's clothing, the oversized garments emphasized her small stature, but they also revealed a practical side to her nature that impressed him. Many women of her class would have refused to wear such attire under any circumstances. "We need to talk about the horse situation," Marcus said. "Belle here is steady, but she's not used to carrying two riders, and riding double is going to be close." Sarah understood the implications immediately. "I'm not going to swoon over impropriety, Mr. Cole. I think we've moved well beyond conventional social rules." Marcus found himself grinning despite the seriousness of their situation. "I believe we have it that, Miss Hayes." He helped her mount behind him, guiding her hands to his belt where she could hold on securely. The contact was unavoidably intimate, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the practical aspects of staying on the horse rather than the impropriety of embracing a strange man. "Where are we going?" she asked as Marcus urged Belle into a steady walk. "About 20 miles north up in the hill country. There's an old line shack I use sometimes when I need to lay low. It's not fancy, but it's defensible and well hidden." As they rode, Marcus found himself studying his passenger through peripheral vision. She sat straight despite her exhaustion, her hands steady on his belt, her head turning slightly as she listened to the sounds around them. There was something almost regal about her bearing, even dressed in his ill-fitting clothes and riding behind an outlaw like a common criminal. "Tell me about your family," Sarah said after they'd ridden in silence for a while. "I've shared my troubles. It seems only fair you share yours." Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him sound older than his years. Not much family left to speak of. Parents died when I was 16. Older brother took care of me for a while, but he was killed in a range war in South Texas. I'm sorry, long time ago. After that, I sort of drifted from one thing to another. Cowboy, deputy sheriff for a while, Army scout during the Indian troubles. What changed? Sarah asked quietly. What made you turn outlaw? Another long silence followed. Sarah was beginning to think she'd overstepped when Marcus finally answered. Caught the wrong people stealing cattle and made the mistake of trying to arrest them. Turned out they were connected to some powerful folks who didn't appreciate the interference. Next thing I knew, I was the one with a price on my head for rustling. But you were innocent. Innocence doesn't count for much when the wrong people want you gone, Marcus said bitterly. I learned that lesson the hard way. Sarah absorbed this, recognizing the parallels to her own situation. Both of them had been betrayed by people who should have protected them. Both had been forced to flee from lives they'd built. Both were now existing on the margins of respectable society. How long have you been running? She asked. 3 years, give or take. Don't you get tired of it? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Every day. But what's the alternative? Turn myself in and hope for a fair trial? We both know how that would end. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they continued north. The terrain was gradually changing, becoming more rugged as they left the river bottom and climbed into the hill country. Sarah could feel the difference in Belle's gait as she navigated increasingly rocky ground. Tell me what you see, Sarah said suddenly. What? The landscape. I used to love riding through this country when I was younger. Tell me what it looks like now. Marcus found himself unexpectedly moved by the request. Rolling hills covered in live oak and cedar. The grass is still green from the spring rains, though it's starting to brown in the open areas. There's a red-tailed hawk circling over that ridge to our right. What about the sky? Marcus looked up, realizing he'd stopped really noticing such things years ago. Clear blue, with a few white clouds building in the west. Might rain later tonight. I always loved the way the light looked just before a storm, Sarah said wistfully, all golden and strange. Something in her voice made Marcus look around with fresh eyes, seeing the landscape as she might remember it, rather than simply as terrain to be crossed. The afternoon light did have a particular quality, warm and honey-colored, that made everything seem more vivid than usual. They stopped to rest the horse at a small spring hidden among a grove of cottonwoods. Marcus helped Sarah down, then led Belle to water while Sarah sat gratefully on a fallen log. We should reach the cabin before full dark, Marcus said, settling down beside her. It's not much, but it's got a good roof and 4 walls. It sounds like a palace, Sarah replied, and she wasn't entirely joking. The prospect of shelter, of being able to rest without constantly looking over her shoulder, was almost too good to believe. There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus said, his tone growing serious. Food, supplies, that sort of thing. The cabin's got some basics, but not enough for 2 people for any length of time. What do you suggest? There's a settlement about 15 miles west called Cedar Creek. Small place, mostly farmers and ranchers. I know someone there who might help us, but it would mean taking some risks. Sarah considered this. What kind of risks? The kind where we might be recognized. You're probably not known that far from your father's ranch, but there are wanted posters with my face on them scattered all over this part of Texas. Then we don't go together, Sarah said practically. You get what we need, and I stay hidden at the cabin. Marcus shook his head. I'm not leaving you alone out there. Too many things could go wrong, such as wild animals for one. This is still a frontier country, and there are wolves, bears, mountain lions. Then there are the human predators, renegades, deserters, men who wouldn't think twice about hurting a woman alone. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She'd grown up hearing stories of such dangers, but they'd always seemed remote from her protected life on the ranch. Now they were very real possibilities. What do you suggest then? We make the supplies we have last as long as possible while we figure out a long-term plan. Maybe send a word to someone you trust, if there is someone. Sarah thought about this. There might be. My father's foreman, Joe Martinez. He's worked for the Hayes family for 20 years. If anyone would believe my story, it would be Joe. Can you trust him completely? I think so. But how would we get word to him without alerting? My stepmother, Marcus, pondered this problem as they resumed their journey. The shadows were growing longer, and he wanted to reach the cabin before they lost the light entirely. We'll figure something out, he said finally. Right now, let's focus on getting you somewhere safe. As they climbed higher into the hills, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. This morning, she'd been a prisoner in her own home, helpless and dependent on people who wanted her dead. Now she was riding through the Texas wilderness with an outlaw, dressed in men's clothes, and planning what amounted to a campaign of revenge against her own family. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. The cabin appeared just as the last light was fading from the sky, a small, sturdy structure tucked into a grove of live oaks that made it nearly invisible from a distance. Marcus helped Sarah down from the horse and guided her to the door while he secured Belle for the night. "Home, sweet home," he said, pushing open the door and striking a match to light the oil lamp inside. The cabin was spartanly furnished, but clean and well-maintained. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table and 2 chairs, a narrow bunk against one wall, and shelves holding basic supplies. It wasn't luxury, but after the day's events it felt like a sanctuary. "There's only one bed," Marcus observed, suddenly aware of the complications their situation presented. Sarah smiled slightly. "Mr. Cole, I've been sleeping on the ground in my father's house for the past 4 years because my stepmother decided I didn't deserve a proper room. A blanket on the floor would be a significant improvement." Marcus found himself once again impressed by her resilience. "You'll take the bed. I've slept in worse places." As they settled in for the night, Sarah lying on the narrow bunk and Marcus arranging blankets near the fireplace, both were acutely aware that their lives had been irrevocably changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new dangers. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Hayes fell asleep feeling safe. Dawn arrived with a symphony of sounds that Sarah had learned to appreciate since losing her sight. Birds calling from the oak trees surrounding the cabin, the soft nickering of Belle as she grazed nearby, and the gentle crackling of the fire that Marcus had rekindled before she woke. For the first time in months, Sarah felt truly rested. "Good morning." Marcus's voice came from across the small cabin, warm with something that might have been contentment. "Sleep well?" Sarah stretched carefully on the narrow bunk, testing her body for the aches and pains she expected after yesterday's ordeal. Surprisingly, she felt stronger than she had in weeks. "Better than I have in a long time. Thank you for letting me have the bed." Seemed like the right thing to do. She heard him moving around, the clink of metal against metal suggesting he was preparing breakfast. "Coffee's almost ready. Found some beans and bacon in the supplies." The smell of brewing coffee filled the small space, rich and welcoming. Sarah sat up, automatically reaching for the men's clothes she'd worn yesterday, then paused. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to take it the wrong way." His movements stilled. "What is it?" "Yesterday, in the chaos of everything, I didn't really think about the proprieties of our situation. But now, in the light of day..." She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "You're Worried about your reputation, Marcus said, understanding immediately. Being alone with a man, especially one like me. It's not that I don't trust you, Sarah said quickly. You've been nothing but honorable. It's just that if word got out... Marcus set down whatever he'd been holding and moved closer, his boots soft on the wooden floor. Miss Hayes, I understand your concern. But let me ask you something. Do you plan to go back to that world, the one where people would judge you for doing whatever it takes to survive? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on immediate survival that she hadn't fully considered what came after. Even if they proved her stepfamily's guilt, even if she regained her inheritance, could she really return to the suffocating world of social expectations and whispered gossip? I don't know, she admitted. I haven't thought that far ahead. Well, when you do think about it, remember this, Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. The people who would condemn you for surviving, for fighting back, for making the choices you've had to make, those aren't people whose opinions are worth worrying about. Sarah absorbed his words, recognizing the wisdom in them. You sound like you speak from experience. I do. Spent too many years caring what other people thought of me, trying to live up to expectations that were never really mine to begin with. Marcus returned to his cooking, the smell of bacon beginning to fill the air. Freedom's got a price, Miss Hayes, but sometimes it's worth paying. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The food was simple but satisfying, and Sarah found herself marveling at how different everything tasted when she wasn't forcing it down under Victoria's disapproving gaze. We need to talk about what comes next, Marcus said, as they finished eating. Staying here indefinitely isn't an option. My supplies won't last forever, and eventually someone's going to come looking. What do you suggest? Marcus leaned back in his chair, and Sarah could hear the wood creaking under his weight. First, we need to know what's happening back at your ranch. Are they looking for your body? Have they already started the legal process to declare you dead? We need information. And how do we get that without exposing ourselves? Carefully. There's a town called Millerville, about 30 miles south of here. Big enough to have a newspaper, small enough that strangers don't attract too much attention. I could ride down there, see what I can learn. Sarah frowned. That would take you away for at least 2 days, probably 3 to be safe. I don't like leaving you alone that long, but I don't see another choice. The thought of being alone in the wilderness terrified Sarah more than she wanted to admit, but she forced herself to consider it rationally. What would I need to know to survive here by myself? Marcus seemed surprised by her practical approach to the problem. Basic things. How to keep the fire going, where the nearest water source is, what to do if someone comes around. Teach me. For the next several hours, Marcus gave Sarah a crash course in wilderness survival. He showed her how to bank the fire so it would burn slowly through the night, how to count steps to the spring that provided their water, and how to recognize the sounds that might indicate approaching danger. Most important thing, he said, as they practiced her route to the water source, for the 5th time, is to trust your hearing. You've got better ears than most sighted folks, and out here that's a real advantage. Sarah nodded, filing away every detail. As they worked, she became increasingly aware of Marcus as more than just her rescuer. His hands were gentle when he guided her over rough ground, his voice patient when she struggled with a new concept. There was a kindness in him that she suspected he kept well hidden from the world. There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus said as they returned to the cabin. Money. What about it? If we're going to prove what your stepfamily did, we're going to need resources. Lawyers, investigators, maybe bribes for the right people. That takes cash, and I don't exactly have a steady income. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. Before my mother died, she told me about a bank account in Austin. Money she'd set aside without my father's knowledge in case of emergencies. If it's still there, How much? Several $1,000s, enough to fund what we need to do. Marcus whistled softly. That would certainly help, but getting to it would be risky. Banks ask questions, require identification. I know the account number, the password my mother established. If we could find the right person, someone who could access it without raising red flags, Marcus mused. I might know somebody. Woman named Catherine Wells used to work for a bank in San Antonio before she moved out here. She's got connections, and she's not too particular about the legality of her business dealings. Can we trust her? Marcus considered this. As much as we can trust anyone in our situation. Kat's motivated by money, not sentiment, which makes her predictable, and she owes me a favor. The afternoon was spent in further preparation for Marcus's departure. He showed Sarah how to use the rifle he kept in the cabin, though they both hoped she'd never need it. More importantly, he taught her the layout of the surrounding area, helping her create a mental map that would allow her to navigate if she needed to flee. If someone comes looking, someone you don't recognize or trust, you go to the cave, Marcus instructed, guiding her through the escape route one more time. It's about a quarter-mile northeast of here, hidden behind a stand of cedar trees. You wait there until they're gone, no matter how long it takes. Sarah memorized every landmark, every step of the path. The cave was small and uncomfortable, but it was invisible from outside and had a rear entrance that would allow her to escape if needed. As evening approached, they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset. At least Marcus watched, while Sarah listened to the sounds of the forest settling into night. "Tell me about her," Sarah said suddenly. "Who?" "Your mother. You mentioned that both your parents died when you were young, but you haven't talked about what they were like." Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tenderness she hadn't heard before. "She was a school teacher before she married my father. Came from back east somewhere, always talking about books and ideas that seemed too big for our little town." He paused, lost in memory. "She used to read to me and my brother every night, stories about nights and adventures, faraway places." "She sounds wonderful." She was. Always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. "I think that's what killed her in the end." "What do you mean?" "She got sick helping nurse some folks through a cholera outbreak. Could have stayed safe at home, but she said it was her Christian duty to help." Marcus's voice carried old pain. "My father never got over losing her. Think that's what really killed him, not the consumption, the doctor said." Sarah reached out instinctively, her hand finding his arm in the darkness. "I'm sorry." Marcus looked down at her small hand on his sleeve, surprised by the comfort he found in the simple gesture. "Long time ago, but sometimes I wonder what she'd think of what I've become. She'd be proud of you. For being an outlaw, for saving me, for being kind when you could have been cruel, for helping when you could have ridden away." Sarah's voice was firm with conviction. "That's the man she raised, not whatever circumstances forced you to become." Marcus found himself deeply moved by her words, by the faith she seemed to have in his fundamental decency, despite everything she'd heard about his reputation. When was the last time someone had looked past his circumstances to see the person underneath? "You don't really know me," he said quietly. "I know enough. I know you risked your own safety to pull a stranger from a river. I know you've been nothing but gentle and respectful despite having every advantage over me. I know you're planning to help me get justice, even though it could get you killed." Sarah turned her face toward him, her blind eyes somehow finding his. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Marcus found himself leaning slightly, closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Sarah's lips parted slightly, and for a heartbeat, the space between them seemed to shimmer with potential. Then a wolf howled in the distance, breaking the spell and reminding them both of where they were of the dangers that surrounded them. "I should get some sleep," Marcus said, his voice slightly rough. "Want to leave early tomorrow?" "Of course." Sarah rose gracefully, her hand trailing along the cabin wall to guide her to the door. "Marcus?" "Yeah? Be careful. I know you're capable of taking care of yourself, but just be careful." Something in her voice, a note of genuine concern, made Marcus's chest tighten. When was the last time anyone had worried about his safety? "I will be. You too." That night, as Sarah lay on the narrow bunk, listening to Marcus's quiet breathing, across the room, she found herself thinking about the moment by the fire, about the strange pull she'd felt toward this man who had become so important to her so quickly. The attraction was undeniable, but it was more than that. For the first time since losing her sight, she felt truly seen by someone, valued for who she was rather than pitied for what she lacked. Marcus, lying on his bedroll near the dying fire, was having similar thoughts. Sarah Hayes had entered his life like a force of nature, challenging everything he thought he knew about proper ladies and helpless victims. She was brave without being reckless, practical without being cold, and possessed of an inner strength that amazed him. But she was also far above his station, a gentleman's daughter who deserved better than life on the run with a wanted man. Once they cleared her name and secured her inheritance, she could have any life she wanted. Why would she choose one that included him? Morning came too soon, bringing with it the necessity of separation. Marcus prepared for his journey while Sarah tried to hide her anxiety about being left alone. They'd been through the procedures a dozen times, but theory and practice were different things. "Remember," Marcus said as he saddled Belle, "anyone comes around asking questions, you're not here. Hide until they leave, no matter what they say or do." "I understand." Marcus checked his supplies one more time, then turned to face Sarah. She stood in the cabin doorway, wearing his oversized clothes and looking far too small and vulnerable for his peace of mind. "I'll be back in 3 days at most," he promised. "If something happens, if I'm not back in 4 days, you take Belle and head north to Colorado. There are people there who'll help you." Sarah nodded, though they both knew she'd never be able to make such a journey alone. "Find out what you can about my family's situation. And Marcus?" "Yeah? Don't take any unnecessary risks. The information isn't worth your life." Marcus found himself smiling despite his concerns. "Yes, ma'am." He mounted Belle and rode away without looking back, though every instinct screamed at him to turn around and stay with Sarah. She needed him to do this, needed the information he could gather, but leaving her alone felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. Sarah stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then went back inside the cabin. The silence felt oppressive after days of Marcus's steady presence, but she forced herself to focus on practical matters. Water to fetch, fire to maintain, food to prepare. As she went about these tasks, counting steps and using the landmarks Marcus had taught her, Sarah found herself marveling at how much her world had expanded in just a few days. A week ago, she'd been a prisoner in her own home, dependent on others for everything. Now she was managing a wilderness homestead, planning legal strategies, and falling in love with an outlaw. The last thought stopped her cold. Was that what was happening? Was she actually falling in love with Marcus Cole? The answer, she realized with startling clarity, was yes. Despite the impossibility of their situation, despite the differences in their backgrounds, despite the uncertain future that lay ahead, she was definitely falling in love. The question now was what she intended to do about it. The silence stretched through the first day like a living thing, pressing against Sarah from all sides. She had underestimated how much Marcus's presence had meant to her sense of security. Without his steady breathing, his occasional movements, the quiet confidence he radiated, the cabin felt hollow and exposed. But Sarah was determined not to waste the time wallowing in loneliness. She established a routine that would keep her busy and alert. Every morning, she made the careful journey to the spring, counting steps and listening for any sounds that didn't belong. She tended the fire, prepared simple meals from their dwindling supplies, and practiced the rifle drills Marcus had taught her. On the second afternoon, as she sat outside the cabin mending a tear in one of Marcus's spare shirts, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. Hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching from the south. The sound was still distant but growing steadily closer. Moving as quickly as she dared, Sarah extinguished the small fire she'd been using for cooking and gathered the few personal items. Marcus had insisted she keep ready. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way to the escape route, following the path she'd memorized through feel and sound. The cave was exactly where Marcus had said it would be, hidden behind a natural curtain of cedar branches. Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening just as the sound of horses reached the cabin clearing. From her hiding place, she could hear voices carrying on the afternoon air. "Tracks are fresh," a man's voice called out, harsh and unfamiliar. "Someone's been using this place recently. Check inside," another voice ordered, this one carrying authority. "Look for anything that might tell us who's been here." Sarah pressed herself deeper into the cave, barely breathing as she listened to the sounds of her temporary home being searched. Boots tramped across the wooden floor, furniture scraped against wood, and she heard the distinctive sound of supplies being rifled through. "Found some women's clothes," the first voice reported. "Fine fabric, expensive, and they're torn, like maybe from running through brush." Sarah's heart sank. She'd left her ruined dress hanging from a peg inside the cabin, thinking it would be safe there. Now it had become evidence of her presence. "That confirms it," the authoritative voice said with satisfaction. "The Hayes girl was here. Question is, where is she now? Could be she's coming back. We could wait. No time for that. Roberts wants this wrapped up quick and quiet. We search the area, see if we can pick up their trail." For the next hour, Sarah listened in terror as the men combed the area around the cabin. They came frighteningly close to her hiding place several times, their boots crunching through the underbrush just feet from the cave entrance. But Marcus had chosen the location well. The cedar screen was thick enough to hide the opening, unless someone knew exactly where to look. Finally, as the sun began to set, the search party gave up. Sarah heard them mounting their horses and riding away, but she waited until full darkness had fallen before emerging from the cave. Her legs shook as she made her way back to the cabin, counting steps carefully in the moonless night. The cabin had been thoroughly ransacked. Supplies were scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, and her dress was gone. But more troubling than the physical damage was what the search revealed about her situation. Someone was actively hunting her, someone who knew she had survived. The river and was working with an accomplice. As Sarah worked by lamplight to restore some order to the cabin, she tried to piece together what she'd overheard. The name Roberts meant nothing to her, but the casual way the men had discussed wrapping up the situation suggested this wasn't just about recovering a missing heiress. They were being paid to eliminate a problem permanently. Sleep was impossible. That night, every sound made Sarah's heart race. Every creak of the cabin walls made her reach for the rifle. She found herself counting the hours until Marcus's return, praying that he hadn't run into these same men during his journey. Dawn brought no relief, only the grim realization that she was truly alone in hostile territory. The search party knew about the cabin now, which meant they might return with reinforcements. Sarah needed to be ready to run at a moment's notice. She spent the morning preparing a pack with essential supplies, enough to last several days if she had to flee to the cave or attempt to reach help on her own. The prospect terrified her, but the alternative was worse. It was mid-afternoon when she heard a single horse approaching, moving at a steady pace but not racing. Sarah's heart leapt with hope, but she forced herself to remain cautious. The rider could be anyone. "Sarah," Marcus's voice called out as he neared the cabin. "Sarah, it's me." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She ran toward the sound of his voice, guided by Belle's familiar whinny and the creak of leather as Marcus dismounted. "Thank God you're all right," she gasped, and before she could stop herself, she had thrown her arms around him. Marcus caught her instinctively, his arms closing around her small frame as he realized how badly she was shaking. "Hey, what's wrong? What happened?" Through a rush of words, Sarah told him about the search party, about hiding in the cave and listening to them ransack the cabin. Marcus's jaw tightened as she described what she'd overheard. "Roberts," he muttered grimly. "I should have known." "You know him? Hired gun out of San Antonio, works for whoever pays best, no questions asked." Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge. "If your step-family brought in Roberts, they're not planning to take any chances." "What did you learn in town?" Marcus guided her back toward the cabin, his arms still around her shoulders in a gesture that felt both protective and intimate. "Quite a bit, and none of it good. Your stepmother didn't waste any time. She's already filed papers declaring you dead, and she's moving fast on the railroad deal." Sarah's heart sank. "How fast?" "The sale's scheduled to go through next week. Once that happens, proving your survival becomes a lot more complicated." They entered the cabin, and Marcus surveyed the damage with professional eyes. "They did a thorough job. We can't stay here anymore." "Where can we go?" "I made contact with Catherine Wells. She's agreed to help, but we need to get to her place outside Cedar Creek." Marcus began gathering the scattered supplies, his movements efficient and purposeful. "She's also got news about your mother's bank account." "What kind of news?" Marcus paused in his packing, his expression troubled. "The account exists, and it's got even more money than you thought, but there's a problem. Someone's been making inquiries about it, asking questions about your mother's financial arrangements." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Victoria. Probably. Which means they know about the money, and they're trying to get access to it. The implications were staggering. Not only were her step-family trying to steal her inheritance through the land sale, they were also going after her mother's secret savings. The betrayal cut even deeper than Sarah had thought possible. "There's more," Marcus continued gently. "I found out what happened after you disappeared. Your stepbrothers came back claiming they'd lost you in the river, that you'd fallen during the storm. Your father organized search parties, but when they didn't find a body, he believed them. From what I could learn, he's been beside himself with grief. Victoria's been playing the devoted stepmother, comforting him while she pushes through the legal proceedings." Sarah absorbed this information, trying to separate her anger at her father's gullibility from her sorrow at his pain. Benjamin Hayes might not have been the most attentive parent, but she didn't doubt that he genuinely mourned her supposed death. "We need to get to him," she said suddenly. "If I could speak to my father directly, explain what really happened." Marcus shook his head. "Too dangerous. Victoria's got Roberts and his men watching your father closely. They'd never let you get near him. Then what do you suggest? We get to Catherine's place, access your mother's money, and use it to hire some help of our own. There are investigators in Austin who specialize in this kind of work, men who can gather evidence without getting themselves killed." As they prepared to abandon the cabin, Sarah found herself mourning the loss of what had become her first real home in years. Despite its Spartan furnishings and remote location, the little hideaway had represented safety and the beginning of her new life. "I'm sorry we have to leave," Marcus said quietly, seeming to understand her feelings. "I know this place meant Something to you. It did, but it's not the place that mattered. Sarah turned toward him, her blind eyes somehow finding his face. It was having somewhere I belonged, somewhere I was valued for who I am instead of what I represent. Marcus felt his chest tighten at her words. You'll have that again. I promise. Will I? Sarah's voice was soft, vulnerable. When this is all over, when my name is cleared and my inheritance secured, what then? Do I go back to being Benjamin Hayes's blind daughter, hidden away from the world? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Marcus found himself struggling with his own conflicting desires. He wanted Sarah to be safe, to have the comfortable life she deserved. But the thought of her returning to that gilded cage, of losing her to a world where he could never follow, was almost unbearable. That's your choice to make, he said finally. But whatever you decide, it should be because it's what you want, not because it's what other people expect. They rode through the night toward Cedar Creek, Sarah once again mounted behind Marcus on Belle. The familiar rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of Marcus's back against her chest provided comfort during the long, uncertain journey. As dawn broke, they paused to rest in a grove of mesquite trees. Marcus helped Sarah down and stretched his own cramped muscles while Belle grazed on the sparse grass. "Tell me about Catherine Wells," Sarah said as they shared water and dried meat from their supplies. "She's complicated," Marcus replied after. "A moment's consideration. Smart as a whip, tougher than most men I've known, and absolutely ruthless when it comes to business. But she's also got her own code of honor. If she gives her word, she keeps it. Can we trust her?" "As far as anyone can be trusted in this situation. Kat's motivated by profit, but she's also got no love for the kind of men your step-family hired. She's had her own run-ins with Roberts over the years." Sarah nodded, filing away this information. "What does she expect in return for her help?" Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry about his answer. "A percentage of whatever money we recover. And—" he hesitated. "And what?" "She wants to meet you. Says she's curious about the woman who could convince Marcus Cole to stick his neck out for a stranger." There was something in his tone that made Sarah suspect there was more to the story. But she didn't press. They all had their secrets, their complicated histories. As long as Catherine Wells could help them accomplish their goals, her motivations were secondary. They reached the outskirts of Cedar Creek as the sun reached its zenith. The settlement was larger than Sarah had expected, with perhaps 50 buildings, scattered along both sides of a dusty main street. The sound of commerce filled the air. Horses and wagons hammering from a blacksmith shop, voices calling out greetings and conducting business. Catherine Wells lived in a house on the north side of town, set apart from the other buildings by a grove of cottonwood trees and a white-painted fence. As they rode up the gravel drive, Sarah heard the front door open and footsteps approaching. "Well, well," a woman's voice called out, rich and amused. "Marcus Cole, as I live and breathe. And this must be the famous Sarah Hayes." Marcus dismounted and helped Sarah down, then turned to greet their hostess. "Kat, thanks for agreeing to help." "My pleasure, darling. It's been far too long since we had a chance to catch up." There was something in the woman's tone, a familiarity, that suggested a history between her and Marcus that went beyond casual acquaintance. Sarah felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by confusion at her own reaction. "Miss Hayes," Catherine said, approaching with confident steps, "I'm Catherine Wells. Welcome to my home." Sarah extended her hand, which Catherine took in a firm, businesslike grip. The woman's fingers were soft but strong, and she wore several rings that suggested both wealth and a taste for display. "Thank you for helping us, Mrs. Wells. I understand the risks you're taking." It's Miss Wells, dear, and the risks are manageable if one knows what one is doing. Catherine's voice carried amusement and something else, an appraising quality that made Sarah feel as though she were being evaluated. Shall we go inside? We have much to discuss and very little time to discuss it. The house proved to be elegantly furnished, with rich fabrics and imported furniture that spoke of considerable wealth. Catherine led them to a comfortable sitting room where refreshments had been laid out on a low table. First things first, Catherine said, settling into a chair with practiced grace. I've made contact with the bank in Austin. Your mother's account is indeed substantial, Miss Hayes. Nearly $8,000, plus accumulated interest. Sarah gasped. She'd expected a few $100s at most, money her mother might have saved from household expenses. $8,000 was a fortune, enough to fund their legal battle and ensure her independence regardless of the outcome. However, Catherine continued, there are complications. Someone has indeed been making inquiries, and they've provided documentation suggesting they have legal authority to access the funds as your next of kin. Victoria, Sarah said grimly. Most likely. The bank is being cautious, which is good for us. They've frozen the account pending verification of the claims being made. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Can we get to the money before they do? Catherine smiled, and Sarah could hear the predatory satisfaction in her voice. My dear, Marcus, you wound me. Of course we can, but it will require some creative approaches to banking regulations. What followed was the most detailed discussion of financial fraud that Sarah had ever been party to. Catherine outlined a plan that involved forged documents, bribed officials, and a carefully orchestrated sequence of transactions that would make the money accessible while covering their tracks. It's not strictly legal, Catherine admitted cheerfully, but then again, neither is attempted murder or inheritance fraud. I prefer to think of it as evening the scales of justice. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself impressed despite her misgivings. Catherine Wells was clearly a woman who operated outside conventional boundaries, but she was also brilliant, resourceful, and apparently committed to their cause. But there was something else, something Sarah couldn't quite identify. The way Catherine spoke to Marcus, the subtle undercurrents in their conversation, suggested a relationship more complex than simple business associates. As evening approached and they prepared for what Catherine called Phase 1 of their operation, Sarah finally found the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her all day. Marcus, she said quietly, catching him alone as Catherine made final preparations in another room. What exactly is your history with Miss Wells? Marcus was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could almost feel his internal struggle. We were involved a few years back, before the trouble started, before I had to go on the run. The simple statement hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she tried not to show it. I see. It was a long time ago, Sarah, and it ended badly. But she still cares for you. It wasn't a question, and Marcus didn't try to deny it. Maybe. But what Kat and I had, it wasn't real. Not like... He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but Sarah heard the implication anyway. Not like what was growing between the two of them, the connection that neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both felt with increasing intensity. We should focus on the task at hand, Sarah said, though her heart was racing. Everything else can wait until we've dealt with my step-family. Marcus nodded, grateful for her understanding, even as he cursed himself for the complications his past had brought to their situation. But as Catherine called them to begin their mission, he found himself hoping that when the dust settled, he'd have the chance to finish what he'd started to tell Sarah. The game was about to begin in earnest, and the stakes had never been higher. The Austin First National Bank stood like a fortress of respectability on Congress Avenue, its limestone facade radiating the kind of institutional permanence that made Sarah's planned deception feel all the more audacious. She sat in Catherine's elegant carriage, her heart hammering beneath the borrowed dress that transformed her from wilderness survivor back into a lady of means. "Remember," Catherine murmured beside her, "you are Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, recently widowed, seeking to transfer funds from your late mother's account to your new residence in Dallas. You've been living abroad and are unfamiliar with local banking procedures, which explains any hesitation in your manner." Sarah nodded, running her fingers over the forged documents that would supposedly establish her identity. Catherine's connections had produced remarkably convincing paperwork, complete with official seals and aging that made them appear genuinely historical. "What if they ask questions I can't answer? Then you become overcome with grief at discussing your recent losses," Catherine replied smoothly. "Men are terrified of weeping women. They'll hurry through the transaction just to get you out of their office." Marcus sat across from them, dressed in the respectable attire of a businessman rather than his usual frontier clothing. He would play Catherine's associate, Mr. Harrison, there to handle the technical aspects of the financial transfer while the grieving widow composed herself. "I still don't like this plan," Marcus said quietly. "Too many things could go wrong." "Everything worth doing involves risk, darling," Catherine replied, her hand briefly touching his knee in a gesture that made Sarah's jaw tighten involuntarily. "Besides, we've covered every contingency." The carriage stopped in front of the bank, and Sarah heard the driver climbing down to open their door. This was it. For the next hour, she would need to be someone else entirely, someone confident and entitled and utterly convinced of her right to access funds that legally belonged to her anyway. The bank's interior was all polished marble and hushed voices, the kind of place where fortunes were made and lost with the scratch of a pen. Sarah allowed Marcus to guide her to a chair, while Catherine approached the main desk with the imperious confidence of someone accustomed to having her demands met immediately. "Good morning." Catherine's voice carried the precise diction of Eastern finishing schools. "Mrs. Whitman requires assistance with a rather substantial financial matter. I trust we can count on your institution's discretion and efficiency." Within minutes, they were ushered into the private office of Mr. Aldrich, the bank's senior manager. Sarah could smell his cologne and pomade, could hear the rustle of expensive fabric as he settled behind his desk. "Mrs. Whitman," Aldrich said, in carefully modulated tones, "please accept my condolences on your recent losses. I understand you wish to access an account established by your late mother?" Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, allowing genuine emotion to color her voice as she spoke of her mother's death. The grief was real, even if the circumstances were fabricated. "Mother was always so careful about financial matters," Sarah said softly. "She established this account as security for her children, but with my recent widowhood—" She trailed off artfully, letting Aldrich draw his own conclusions. Of course. These are difficult times for you." Aldrich's voice carried the practiced sympathy of a man who dealt with grieving families regularly. "Now, I do have some concerns about this account. There have been other inquiries." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "What sort of inquiries? Mr. Aldrich, surely Mrs. Whitman's claim takes precedence, given her direct lineage?" "Well, yes, naturally. But the other party presented documentation suggesting they were acting as legal guardians for the deceased woman's daughter, who was presumed," he paused delicately, "dead." Sarah finished for him, allowing bitterness to creep into her voice. "Yes, I'm aware of those claims. My stepsister's unfortunate accident was a terrible tragedy for our family. The lie came easier than she'd expected, wrapped as it was in kernels of truth." Sarah could feel Aldrich relaxing as her story aligned with the information he'd already received. I see. And can you provide documentation establishing your identity and relationship to the account holder? Marcus stepped forward smoothly, placing a leather portfolio on Aldrich's desk. All the necessary papers are here, sir. Birth certificates, marriage license, death certificates for both Mrs. Whitman's mother and late husband. I believe you'll find everything in order. For the next 20 minutes, Aldrich examined their forged documents with the methodical attention of a man whose career depended on detecting fraud. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, occasionally dabbing at her eyes and murmuring responses to his gentle questions about her family history. Finally, Aldrich set the papers aside and smiled. Everything appears to be in perfect order, Mrs. Whitman. I'll have the funds transferred to your Dallas account immediately. Will a bank draft for the full amount be sufficient? Sarah's relief was so intense she felt momentarily dizzy. That would be perfect. Thank you. As Aldrich prepared the necessary paperwork, Catherine engaged him in small talk about Austin's growth and the challenges of conducting business in such rapidly changing times. Her conversation was perfectly pitched to maintain the atmosphere of respectable routine that made their deception possible. 25 minutes after entering the bank, they emerged with a draft for $8,300 tucked securely in Catherine's reticule. Sarah could barely believe they'd succeeded. Phase 1 complete, Catherine said with satisfaction as their carriage pulled away from the bank. Now for the more challenging part. Marcus frowned. What's more challenging than bank fraud? Staying alive long enough to enjoy the proceeds. The truth of her words became apparent as soon as they returned to Catherine's house. A man sat waiting on the front porch, his presence somehow making the peaceful street feel dangerous. He was lean and weathered, with pale eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of their approach. That's Jake Morrison, Marcus said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. One of Roberts's men. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Sarah could feel the tension radiating from her. Well then, it appears our reputation has preceded us. Morrison rose as they approached, his movements casual but alert. Miss Wells. Cole. His gaze settled on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity, and this must be the famous Miss Hayes who's been causing so much trouble. I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else, Sarah replied evenly, maintaining her pose as Mrs. Whitman. I'm simply a visitor to your charming city, Morrison chuckled, the sound carrying no humor. Ma'am, I've been hunting people for 15 years. I know when someone's playing pretend. He stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell tobacco and leather on his clothes. Question is, what do we do about it? Marcus moved protectively. In front of Sarah, his voice carrying deadly calm. That depends on what you want, Morrison. What I want is simple. My employer would like to have a conversation with Miss Hayes here, private-like. Not happening, Marcus replied flatly. Morrison's smile widened. See, that's where you're wrong, Cole. Because my employer's got something you want, something he's willing to trade for a few minutes of Miss Hayes's time. Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice carefully neutral. What sort of something? Benjamin Hayes. Seems the old man's been asking inconvenient questions about his daughter's death, making noise about hiring investigators, offering rewards for information. Morrison paused for effect. My employer thought he might be more cooperative if he had some incentive. Sarah's blood ran cold. You have my father. Not me personally, but he's safe for now. Whether he stays that way depends on how reasonable you're willing to be. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her step-family had escalated from attempted murder to kidnapping, using her father as leverage to force her compliance. The betrayal was so complete, so monstrous, that she could barely process it. What does Roberts want? Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Like I said, just a conversation. Miss Hayes comes with me. We have a nice chat, and afterward everyone goes their separate ways. Simple. And if she refuses, Morrison shrugged, then Benjamin Hayes has an unfortunate accident, and we continue this conversation under less pleasant circumstances. Sarah felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Submit to whatever Roberts had planned and likely die, or condemn her father to death for the crime of loving her enough to ask questions. Where? She asked quietly. Sarah. No, Marcus said sharply. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap, Sarah replied. But they have my father. She turned toward Morrison, though she couldn't see him. Where and when? There's an old warehouse on the east side of town, near the rail yards. Sunset tonight. Come alone. She won't be alone, Marcus stated flatly. Morrison's laugh was genuinely amused. Cole, you're wanted for murder in 3 counties. You really want to add kidnapping and bank fraud to that list? Because I know exactly what you 3 were doing at First National this morning. The threat was clear. Morrison had been watching them, gathering evidence of their activities. If they didn't cooperate, he could have them all arrested before they ever reached the warehouse. Besides, Morrison continued conversationally, Miss Hayes won't really be alone. She'll have her loving family with her. The cruel mockery in his voice made Sarah's hands clench into fists. These people had murdered her mother, tried to drown her, kidnapped her father, and were now taunting her with promises of reunion. I'll be there, Sarah said firmly. Morrison tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am, and Cole. I'd think real careful about trying anything heroic. My employer's got a lot of friends in this town, friends who wouldn't appreciate their evening being disrupted. After Morrison left, they sat in Catherine's parlour in tense silence. Sarah could feel both her companions watching her, evaluating her state of mind, probably planning arguments about why she shouldn't go through with the meeting. It's suicide, Marcus said finally. Roberts isn't planning to let any of you walk away from that warehouse. Probably not, Sarah agreed. But if there's even a chance my father is still alive. There isn't, Catherine said bluntly. Men like Roberts don't leave loose ends. Your father is almost certainly already dead. The words hit Sarah like a slap, but she forced herself to consider them rationally. Catherine was probably right. Benjamin Hayes represented a threat to Victoria's plans, and dead men told no tales. Then why the elaborate charade? Sarah asked. Why not just kill me on the street? Catherine and Marcus exchanged a look that Sarah couldn't see but could sense. Because they need something from you first, Marcus said reluctantly. Probably a signed confession, something that would justify their actions and clear their legal claim to your inheritance. Or, Catherine added thoughtfully, they need you to publicly withdraw any claims you might make. A living witness to your own willing renunciation of rights would be much more convincing than a dead one. Sarah absorbed this, turning the possibilities over in her mind. Either way, the outcome would be the same. Once she'd served their purpose, she would disappear permanently. So we don't go, Marcus said. We take the money, get out of Texas, start over somewhere else. The suggestion should have been appealing. Sarah could disappear, assume a new identity, live comfortably on her mother's savings. She could be free from the Hayes family forever, free to build whatever life she chose. But the image of her father, frightened and confused, held prisoner by people he trusted, made such escape impossible. I can't abandon him, Sarah said quietly. Whatever his faults, whatever mistakes he's made, he's still my father. He doesn't deserve to die because Victoria wants my inheritance. Marcus knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. Sarah, listen to me. Your father made his choices when he married Victoria, when he let her control his household, when he didn't protect you from her cruelty. You don't owe him your life. Maybe not, Sarah replied. But I owe myself the knowledge that I didn't become like them, that when faced with the choice between my safety and someone else's life, I chose compassion over self-preservation. Catherine. made a sound that might have been approval or exasperation. Well, if you're determined to commit suicide, at least let's do it with style. Both Sarah and Marcus turned toward her, surprised by her apparent acceptance of the situation. "You have a plan?" Marcus asked warily. Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "My dear Marcus, I always have a plan. The question is whether you two are prepared to execute it." What followed was the most audacious scheme Sarah had ever heard. Catherine's plan involved careful timing, strategic misdirection, and a level of risk that would have seemed insane under any other circumstances. "The warehouse district is mostly deserted after dark," Catherine explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across her dining table. "But there are multiple ways in and out, and the rail yard provides excellent cover for movement." She traced various routes with her finger, describing sight lines and escape routes with the precision of someone who had studied the terrain carefully. "Roberts will expect you to come alone and helpless," Catherine continued. "What he won't expect is for you to arrive with allies already in position." Marcus studied the map intently. It could work, but the timing would have to be perfect. "When? Has my timing ever been anything less than impeccable?" Catherine asked, with false modesty. As evening approached, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus for the first time since Catherine's revelation about their past relationship. They stood on the back porch of Catherine's house, listening to the sounds of Austin settling into night. "I need to ask you something," Sarah said quietly, "and I need you to answer honestly." Marcus tensed. "What is it? Are you doing this because you care about me, or because you feel guilty about Catherine?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond their immediate situation. "Sarah," Marcus began, then stopped. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of emotion she'd never heard before. "What I had with Catherine was complicated. We used each other, probably hurt each other. But what I feel for you—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't seem adequate. "I've never met anyone like you," he continued finally. "Your strength, your courage, the way you refuse to let circumstances break you. When I pulled you out of that river, I thought I was saving your life. But the truth is, you saved mine." Sarah felt her heart racing as she processed his words. "Marcus, I know I'm not the kind of man you should be with," he continued quickly. "I know you deserve better than life on the run with an outlaw. But if we survive tonight, if we get through this, I want you to know that what I feel for you is real." Before Sarah could respond, Catherine's voice called from inside the house. "Time to go, children. Destiny awaits." As they prepared to leave, for what might be their final confrontation, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she'd been a victim, helpless and dependent on others' mercy. Tonight, she was about to walk into a trap with her eyes wide open, determined to save the father who had failed to save her. The transformation was complete. Sarah Hayes was no longer the blind rancher's daughter who had been left to drown at the river's edge. She was a woman who had found her strength in darkness and was prepared to use it to light her way home. The warehouse district of Austin after dark was a landscape of shadows and silence, broken only by the distant whistle of trains and the occasional scurry of rats through the debris. Sarah walked slowly down the empty street, her cane tapping rhythmically against the packed earth, every sense alert for signs of danger or deception. She wore the same elegant dress she'd used for the bank fraud, but now it felt like armor rather than disguise. In her reticule, carefully concealed, was a small derringer that Catherine had insisted she carry. Sarah had never fired a gun at another human being, but the weight of it against her hip provided a strange comfort. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive structure of brick and timber that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Light flickered in the windows of the main floor, and Sarah could hear voices from within, though she couldn't make out individual words. As she approached the main entrance, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Roberts himself, she realized, recognizing the authoritative bearing that Morrison had described. "Miss Hayes," Roberts said, his voice cultured but cold, "thank you for being so reasonable. Please, come inside. Your family is waiting." The word family dripped with sarcasm, but Sarah maintained her composure as Roberts escorted her through the warehouse doors. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps scattered throughout the cavernous space, creating pools of light separated by vast areas of darkness. In the center of the main floor, several chairs had been arranged in a rough circle. Victoria sat in one, resplendent in black silk that made her look like a beautiful vulture. Her sons flanked her, Robert and James both armed and watching Sarah with predatory satisfaction. And there, tied to a chair with his head hanging low, was Benjamin Hayes. Sarah's heart lurched at the sight of her father. He looked older than she remembered, his hair grayer, his shoulders stooped with defeat. A bruise darkened one side of his face, and his clothes were torn and dirty. "Father?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the warehouse. Benjamin's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Sarah! My God, Sarah, is it really you?" "Hello, Father." Sarah walked toward him, guided by Robert's firm grip on her arm. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home." "But you're dead," Benjamin whispered, confusion and hope warring in his voice. "They told me you drowned in the river." "They told you many things," Sarah replied, her gaze shifting to her stepfamily. "Most of them lies." Victoria rose from her chair with fluid grace, her beautiful face twisted into an expression of cold fury. "You should have stayed dead, dear stepdaughter. It would have been so much simpler for everyone. Simpler for you, perhaps. But I've found that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried." James stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Still running your mouth blind, girl? Some things never change." "You're right," Sarah agreed calmly. "Some things never change. Your cowardice, for instance. It still takes two of you to face one unarmed woman." Robert's face flushed with anger. "You're not in a position to insult anyone, in case you haven't noticed. You're outnumbered." "Am I?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, listening to sounds that only she could detect. "Are you certain about that?" Roberts frowned, his professional instincts picking up on something in her tone. "Search her," he ordered Morrison, who had been standing guard near the door. Morrison approached cautiously, his hands running over Sarah's dress with practiced efficiency. He found the derringer immediately, holding it up with a sardonic smile. "Well, well, the little lamb has teeth after all." "Did you really think I'd come here completely defenseless?" Sarah asked. "Credit me with some intelligence." "Intelligence won't save you now," Victoria said, retaking her seat with theatrical grace. "You're going to sign a document renouncing any claim to your father's estate, and then you're going to disappear again, permanently this time." "And if I refuse?" Victoria's smile was like winter sunlight, beautiful and utterly without warmth. "Then your father will pay the price for your stubbornness." As if to emphasize the threat, James drew his pistol and pressed it against Benjamin's temple. The older man winced, but didn't cry out, his eyes fixed on his daughter with a mixture of love and desperate apology. "Sarah," Benjamin said quietly, "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have seen what they were, what they wanted. You see it now, Father. That's what matters." Roberts moved to a small table where papers had been spread out, along with pen and ink. "The documents are quite straightforward, Miss Hayes. A simple statement that you renounce all claims to the Hayes Ranch and its assets, acknowledging that you were never legally entitled to them." Sarah made no move toward the table. "And you expect me to believe that you'll let us walk away after I sign?" "Of course not," Victoria said with delighted malice. "But your father might live a few minutes longer if you cooperate." "Surely that's worth something to you." The cruelty in her stepmother's voice was breathtaking in its casualness. Here was a woman who had murdered her way to wealth and power, and who clearly enjoyed every moment of it. "You killed my mother," Sarah said suddenly, the realization hitting her with crystalline clarity. Victoria's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Whatever gave you that idea?" "The timing. The way she died so conveniently, just as you were positioning yourself to marry my father. The fever that took her but spared everyone else in the household." "Fever is unpredictable," Victoria replied with a shrug. "Some people have stronger constitutions than others." But Sarah could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the pride of someone who had committed the perfect crime and gotten away with it. "Poison," Sarah continued, the pieces falling into place. "Something that would mimic fever symptoms. Arsenic, perhaps, administered over time." Victoria's silence was enough. Benjamin made a choking sound of horror and rage, struggling against. "His bonds, you murdering witch!" he gasped. "Elizabeth, my Elizabeth!" "Your Elizabeth was weak," Victoria said dismissively. "She would have held you back, kept you from reaching your full potential. I freed you from that burden." The casual admission of murder seemed to galvanize something in Benjamin. Despite his age and infirmity, he lunged forward in his chair, nearly toppling it in his effort to reach his wife's killer. In that moment of distraction, as all eyes turned to the struggling man, Sarah heard what she'd been waiting for. The softest scrape of boot leather against wood coming from the warehouse's upper galleries. Catherine's plan was in motion. "Enough," Robert said, drawing his own weapon. "Sign the papers, Miss Hayes, or watch your father die right now." Sarah moved toward the table with deliberate slowness, her hand hovering over the pen. "Before I sign, I want to know one thing. What happened to Joe Martinez?" The question seemed to catch Victoria off guard. "Who?" "My father's foreman. The man who's been loyal to this family for 20 years. Where is he?" Victoria exchanged a glance with Roberts, who shrugged. "He asked too many questions. Like father, like employee." The implication was clear. Joe Martinez was dead, murdered for the crime of caring about Sarah's fate. Another innocent life snuffed out to serve Victoria's ambitions. Sarah picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly. "You've killed so many people. My mother Joe, probably others I don't even know about, all for money." "Not just money," Victoria corrected. "Power, freedom, the right to live life on my own terms instead of being trapped by other people's expectations." "And you think that justifies murder?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "I think that survival justifies whatever actions are necessary. The strong take what they want, and the weak suffer what they must. That's the way the world really works, dear stepdaughter." Sarah dipped the pen in ink, then paused. "You're wrong about something, Victoria." "What's that?" "You're wrong about who's weak and who's strong." With those words, Sarah flung the ink across the table, sending a spray of black liquid across the documents and into James's face. In the same motion, she dove sideways, rolling away from the table as chaos erupted around her. Gunshots rang out from the upper galleries as Marcus and Catherine's other allies opened fire on Robert's men. The warehouse filled with smoke and confusion, shouts and screams echoing off the high ceiling. Sarah crawled toward her father, following the sound of his voice as he called her name. Bullets whined overhead, and she could hear boots running across the floor as men sought cover. "Sarah!" Benjamin's voice was closer now. "Over here!" She found him still tied to his chair, but the ropes had been loosened by his struggles. Working quickly, Sarah freed his hands while gunfire continued around them. "Can you move?" she asked urgently. "I think so." "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you, should have protected you from them." "Save the apologies for later. Father, right now we need to get out of here." Supporting each other, they made their way toward what Sarah hoped was the rear exit. Behind them, she could hear Victoria screaming orders, her voice shrill with rage and fear. A figure loomed out of the smoke ahead of them, and Sarah's heart leaped with relief as she recognized Marcus's silhouette. "This way," he said, taking Benjamin's other arm. "Catherine's got horses waiting in the alley." They stumbled through the warehouse's maze of machinery and storage, guided by Marcus's knowledge of the building's layout. Behind them, the gunfight continued, but the sounds were growing more distant. As they reached the rear door, Sarah heard footsteps behind them. She turned to see Robert emerging from the smoke, his face bloody from her ink attack, but his gun steady in his hand. "Going somewhere?" he snarled, raising the weapon. The derringer seemed to leap into Sarah's hand of its own accord. She'd never fired a gun in her life, had never even held one before Catherine pressed it into her palm hours earlier. But as Robert's finger tightened on the trigger, instinct took over. The small pistol bucked in her grip, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. Robert's eyes widened in surprise. Then he crumpled to the floor, clutching his shoulder. "Nice shot," Marcus said with genuine admiration. "I was aiming for his chest," Sarah admitted shakily. "Even better. Come on." They burst out of the warehouse, into the cool night air, where Catherine waited with 3 horses and a look of fierce satisfaction. "I do love it when a plan comes together," she said, helping Benjamin mount one of the horses. "Though I must say, that ink trick was inspired by improvisation." "What about Roberts?" Sarah asked as Marcus helped her onto her horse. "Let's just say he won't be troubling anyone anymore," Catherine replied cryptically. "My associates were quite thorough." As they rode away from the warehouse district, Sarah could hear the sound of approaching sirens. The Austin Fire Department was responding to reports of gunfire and smoke, but they would find only the aftermath of Victoria's ambitions. They rode hard through the night, putting distance between themselves and the scene of the confrontation. It wasn't until they stopped to rest at dawn that Benjamin finally found his voice. "Sarah," he said, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief, "can you ever forgive me?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Her father had failed her in so many ways, had allowed Victoria to poison their home and nearly destroy their family. But he was also a man who had been deceived and manipulated by someone far more cunning than he. "I forgive you, father, but things can never go back to the way they were." Benjamin nodded slowly. "I understand. What will you do now?" Sarah looked at Marcus, who was tending to the horses with his back diplomatically turned to give them privacy. "I'm going to live my life on my terms, not anyone else's." "With him?" Benjamin's voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. "Possibly. We have some things to work out." Over the next few days, as news of the warehouse shootout spread through Texas, the full scope of Victoria's crimes began to emerge. Catherine's connections in law enforcement had ensured that the surviving members of Robert's gang were willing to testify about their employer's activities, including Victoria's role in the various murders. Victoria herself had vanished during the chaos of the gunfight, but her sons had been captured. Faced with hanging for murder, they quickly agreed to provide evidence against their mother in exchange for prison sentences. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive, with the forged documents exposed and witness testimony. About Victoria's crimes, Sarah's inheritance was fully restored. More importantly, her mother's murder was officially acknowledged, giving Elizabeth Hayes the justice she had been denied in life. Benjamin Hayes proved to be a broken man, aged beyond his years by the revelation of his wife's true nature and his own failures as a father. He signed over full control of the ranch to Sarah, then retired to a small house in Austin where he could live quietly with his guilt and regrets. 2 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of the ranch house that was now truly hers, listening to the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and cowboys calling to each other as they went about their work. Joe Martinez had been replaced by a new foreman, but his memory was honored in the way the ranch was run, with fairness, integrity, and respect for those who did the hard work that made prosperity possible. Marcus approached from the direction of the barn, his footsteps familiar and welcome on the wooden boards of the porch. "Fence line repaired in the south pasture," he reported, settling into the chair beside hers. "Should hold through the winter." "Good. And the new hands?" "Working out well. They respect the fact that you know what you're talking about, even if some of them are still getting used to taking orders from a woman." Sarah smiled. "They'll adjust. People always do, eventually." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the land that had been fought for with blood and determination. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Sarah, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Are you happy?" "Really happy, I mean. Not just relieved or satisfied, but genuinely happy." Sarah considered the question seriously. "I am. For the first time in years, I'm living the life I choose rather than the life others have chosen for me. I'm using my abilities instead of being limited by my disability. I'm surrounded by people who value me for who I am. And what about us?" The question had been hanging between them for weeks, unspoken but always present. Sarah reached out, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "Marcus Cole, are you proposing to me? I'm asking if you'd want me to. I know I'm not the kind of man you were raised to marry. I know there are things in my past that will always make life complicated." "There are things in my past, too," Sarah reminded him. "I'm a woman who's killed a man, stolen money, and destroyed her own family. I'm hardly a conventional choice myself." Marcus chuckled. "When you put it like that, we sound perfect for each other." Sarah rose from her chair and moved to the porch railing, Marcus following. The night air was cool and sweet, filled with the scents of grass and wildflowers. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people," she said quietly. "That my blindness meant I was destined to live on the margins, dependent on others' charity and tolerance. And now I know that happiness isn't something you find or something that's given to you. It's something you create, something you choose every day." She turned toward him, her sightless eyes somehow finding his face in the darkness. "And I choose you, Marcus Cole, if you'll have me." His answer was a kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings, of a future built on equal partnership rather than dependence or obligation. When they finally broke apart, Sarah was smiling. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we live," Sarah replied simply. "We run this ranch together. We build something worth having, and we prove that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the strongest foundations." As if to punctuate her words, a nightbird called from the oak trees, surrounding the house, its voice clear and sweet in the darkness. Sarah had learned to find beauty in sounds that others might miss, to build a rich and meaningful life despite the absence of sight. She had been left at a river's edge to drown, abandoned by those who should have protected her. Instead, she had found her strength in the darkness and her salvation in the arms of a man society had branded an outlaw. Sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest challenges. Sometimes being lost was the first step toward finding exactly where you belonged. And sometimes, Sarah thought as Marcus's arms closed around her again, the most perfect endings were really just the beginning of something even better. The Hayes ranch would prosper under their joint leadership, becoming known throughout Texas for its fair treatment of workers and innovative ranching techniques. Marcus's wanted posters were eventually withdrawn when new evidence emerged about the circumstances of his original troubles, clearing his name and giving him the fresh start he'd never dared hope for. But those were stories for another day. Tonight, under the vast Texas sky, Sarah Hayes and Marcus Cole had everything they needed: each other, a home built on their own terms, and a future limited only by their courage to embrace it. The blind rancher's daughter had found her way home at last. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.